Authentication involves proving of identity, and one way is through signing in with a user account. Now, an important part for accountability purposes is that all users have their own separate user account. The last thing you want is everyone signing in with the same set of credentials. In having conducted security audits over the years, I still run into this, believe it or not, where you have a group of users, for convenience sake, are using the same username and password to sign in so that they can gain access to some kind of resource within the organization. That's a no-no. So we need unique passwords and unique usernames. The other thing is that instead of assigning permissions to each and every individual user, which is very hard to manage on a large scale, instead we try to organize users into groups that have the similar requirements and then of course assign permissions to the group. If you've been into network administration, you already know this. It's just the way to deal with scalable environments, so large environments, to facilitate permissions management. We should also make sure that we always adhere to the principle of least privilege. In my experience, this again is something that I see violated over and over and over when it comes to conducting security audits. The principle of least privilege is very simple, at least in theory. You only assign the permissions that are required to perform a function. No more. But you've probably seen this. Have you ever noticed that sometimes due to a lack of time or laziness or lack of the exact permissions that must be set, an administrator might simply say, oh, I'll just drop your account into the administrators group and then you can do whatever you need to do. Because they don't know what individual permissions perhaps are required for you to perform a certain task. That is a problem, and that violates the principle of least privilege. Luckily, conducting periodic security audits will uncover that, or potentially. You'll be able to see who has been, for example, dropped into an administrator's group, and you might question, why is that person in that group? Or why are they still in that group? Maybe they should have been before, but shouldn't be now. So user account auditing. We've talked about the importance of accounting or auditing, such as tracking failed user login attempts. That's always important because that could indicate some kind of attack against user accounts. Or it could be a legitimate user that simply forgot their password. So, depending on the app they're using, they might have to choose the forgot password type of link that we've seen on many websites, or they might need to open up a help desk ticket. The other thing is when users leave the organization, and we talked about this previously when it comes to offboarding processes, instead of deleting a user account right away, normally what happens is the account is disabled. So we retain the user account and all of the data related to it, maybe for a period of time based on organizational policies that then dictate when we can actually delete the user account. Think about it. If you have a user that's left the organization and someone that will succeed them and take their place, maybe you want to keep their data so you can give it to the person fulfilling their role. So deleting a user account and deleting all of that user's data just because they left the organization is not normally done. So the next thing we have to consider is managing accounts and setting rights or privileges for resource access for those accounts. Now, we can build an account for a user. We all know this because we always sign in probably multiple times per day to different resources. But let's not forget that we can also create accounts for devices. If you're a Microsoft Active Directory person, maybe you've joined a computer to a domain so that machine can partake in pulling down group policy settings. Or maybe you create an account for a mobile device, maybe in Azure Active Directory, so you can use that for conditional access. Meaning, if you're using, let's say, an Android smartphone, you're allowed to sign in. But the device would have to be registered. You'd have to have an account for that device first. We can also have accounts for services or for software. Now, of course, we've got administrative type accounts. In the Windows world, the default admin username is administrator. In the Unix and Linux world, the default name, the super user account name, is root. So we have to think about those accounts and how they really need to have multi-factor authentication enabled and complex passwords, because we don't want anyone gaining access to those privileged accounts. And in some cases, you might even create guest accounts. Guest accounts might be used for contractors coming on premises for a period of time to give them limited access to a limited subset of resources. Now let's take a look at how we might create a user account and provide only the required permissions, so adhering to the principle of least privilege. Let's do that in Amazon Web Services in the cloud. Okay, so here in the AWS Management Console, I have a need. I need to create a user account, perhaps for another cloud technician, but I want to limit what permissions they have. So what I'm going to do here in the AWS console is search for IAM, which stands for Identity and Access Management. I'm going to click on that to open it up, which is going to open up a new console where I can work with user and group accounts. So over on the left, I'm going to go ahead and click on Users. Now I've signed in with my root account. What that means is that's the primary account that gets created when you sign up with Amazon Web Services. So there are no additional users shown here. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add User. I'm going to create a user called U1, as in user 1. And down below, I can determine what kind of access this account needs to Amazon Web Services. Is it programmatic access? So are they a software developer? Not in this case. I want them to use the GUI that I'm using here, but only with limited capabilities. So I'm going to choose AWS Management Console Access. And down below, we can have it auto-generate a password, or we can specify a custom password. But again, be careful with that. The last thing you want to do is initiate new accounts with the same password all the time. Because as soon as somebody figures that out, that's a way for them to get into that account temporarily until the password gets changed. So we don't recommend using the same password when you first create accounts. Going down further, do we require a password reset? That's a good security option. Sure, we want to do that because we're going to auto-generate a password, which it will tell us after. We can communicate that to the user, but then they should change it to something that only they know. So next is permissions when I click the next button in the bottom right. So what I can do is I can add this user to a group. I've got an existing group called G1. So if that group has permissions in the cloud, this user's going to be a member of the group, they're going to get permissions from the group. However, I could also, up at the top here, attach existing policies directly to this individual user. There are times when you need to do that, but for the most part, it's a lot easier to assign permissions to groups, isn't it, than individual users. So I'm going to make sure that this account is part of this group here in the cloud. Next for tags, I'm not going to add any tag information, it's just metadata. I'll click Next Review. Okay, I'm happy with this. I'm going to click the Create User button to create the account. And at this point, I can click Show so I can see the auto-generated password. And that I would have to communicate to the user somehow. For convenience, there's even a link here to send an email to the user with that information within it. So that's what we can do. Now, however, what I want to do is I would like to close that and go into look at our groups. So I'm going to click User Groups because I want to take a look at that group G1. Does it or does it not have permissions? Well, I can see right away when I look at the listing of the groups, under the permissions column, it says not defined. So I could go into that group, just open it up, and from here I could click permissions and simply start adding permissions, which I will do. So I'm going to click Add Permissions. I'm going to choose Attach Policies. Here in Amazon Web Services, a policy is a collection of related permissions. So I'm going to search for, let's say, S3, which is for cloud-based storage. And that way I can specify that I can filter out my list to only show certain items, or I could just scroll down and I could choose the specific type of permission set I want. Let's say, for example, I want to allow full relational database access here in the cloud. So I could choose the Amazon RDS Full Access role. I could choose Add Permissions, and then it's done. So if we go back to the user and just check our work real quick, let's open up our user, user1. When I open that up and when I take a look at the permissions down below, it's telling me very clearly that if I choose Show More, I've got Amazon RDS Full Access, which was acquired by being in the group called Group 1. So all of this type of management, creating users, creating groups, assigning permissions, is guided by organizational security policies, by account policies. And sometimes these are taking into consideration any regulatory requirements related to security and data privacy. So during employee onboarding, what we've just done in Amazon Web Services might be part of what we do. We follow a certain set of procedures to create users and groups and assign permissions. We might configure password policies where we define password complexity and password history, how many passwords are remembered to prevent passwords from being reused. That could be part of our account policy. Let's just flip into Windows for one quick second to take a look at account policies. So here in Windows Server to be specific, I'm just going to go to my Start menu and I'm going to search for Local, and I'm going to choose Local Security Policy. This server is not joined to a domain, so I can edit the policy settings directly on this host. It will only affect this single host. So on the left, I could drill down into account policies, password policy. When I click on that, on the right, here's where I can set things like enforcing password history. I can set password complexity requirements, maybe the minimum password length. Maybe I'll set that to be 12 characters. I'll click OK. I even have an account lockout policy I can specify. So I might set the account lockout threshold to 3. After 3 incorrect login attempts, the account gets locked for 30 minutes. I could change that value to be whatever I want it to be. But the great thing about that is if we do have brute force password attacks, then the account will be locked after the 3rd incorrect password attempt. Other things within account policies would include controlling when people can log into systems, or geolocation. Geolocation means that we're going to take a look at where a user is. For example, by tracking their smartphone or looking at the IP address to determine whether or not they should have access to resources. So geofencing is a way that we can do that. Another example of geofencing is when you have a smartphone with an app for a retail outlet and you walk into the mall, all of a sudden it detects that you're in close proximity and it starts displaying the latest sales, maybe even some coupons that you can use while you're in there shopping. Geotagging is another variation of geolocation where using GPS satellite coordinates, when you take pictures on a smartphone, for instance, it automatically can add some extra metadata for those pictures. And that's a treasure trove for forensic analysts if they're looking to find out where a picture was taken, on what type of phone, and any other details related to that. The other thing we have to consider with account policies is where people are signing in terms of impossible travel time. This notion dictates that if a user is signing in from New York City in Manhattan at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then 10 minutes later they're signing in from Austria, it is impossible that they could physically have gone to Austria from New York City in that small amount of time. But these days, where you can use the Tor network to make it appear like you're coming from somewhere else, or even you can VPN into a remote site, and then it looks like you're coming from there, that impossible travel time is not as big of a deal as it once was, but it still is a consideration. And the last thing about account policies and management is being able to determine what's out of the norm. Is it normal for a user to be signing in the middle of the night from Eastern Europe trying to access a sensitive database? Now, in order to determine that that's abnormal, you have to have a baseline of what is normal. So we now see that we have various methods for configuring and managing user accounts and groups, and then getting a little bit deeper to determine what resources they have access to.